So the question why I believe we are all here today is how can exactly Brussels become the catalyst, not only of imagining these different futures, but creating them? How can Brussels turn into a cultural and artistic laboratory that can inspire 500 million European citizens and also other Europeans who are living today in Kosovo, in Montenegro, in Serbia, in Ukraine, and many other countries which are not part of the European Union, but are part of Europe? So hello, I'm really glad and honored to be here today in Brussels. And I'll start with what you could call a downer, let's call it like that, but I think it brings us immediately into the topic. The great Senegalese filmmaker Ousmane Sembène was once asked how were his films understood in Europe. And you probably know what was his famous answer to this question. He said, quote, "Let's be clear, Europe is not my center. Europe is on the outskirts of Africa. Why be a sunflower and turn towards the sun? I myself am the sun." So I don't come from Africa, but Europe or Brussels is also not my center. I arrived yesterday to Brussels from a part of Europe which was by the ancient Greeks 2,500 years ago considered the end of the world. Namely, I came from an island in the middle of the Adriatic Sea. And you know, for the Greeks, for them the center was Athens, and everything which was at that part of the Adriatic Sea was literally, even if you look at the maps from more than 2,000 years ago, it was literally the end of the world. However, as much as I think we can and deserve not to give a damn about the center, even if we don't care about the center, this doesn't mean that the center doesn't care for us. For instance, EU regulations on fishing, EU regulations on food or wine productions, EU regulation on migration, this is everything which is also affecting the island where I live. So you cannot escape Brussels, you cannot escape the European Union. And even if you're not part of the European Union, you still cannot escape the rules of the European Union. Chloe just mentioned the shipwreck where more than 700 people drowned in the Mediterranean Sea. Yesterday, when I was arriving from the island to the port of Split, which is a trip which takes around 2 hours by ship, I looked at something which I think is the best embodiment of our contemporary era. Namely, in front of Split, there was a huge, one of the biggest military ships in the world, Harry S. Truman, which is a nuclear-powered aircraft cruiser, or however you would call it, and it was anchored just in front of Split, while on the other side, on one of the most famous beaches of Split called Bačvice, people were swimming and looking at the ship. And this is something which we encounter every day in Europe, this kind of contradiction, although it's not a contradiction, but this kind of contrast which on a daily level reminds us in which kind of deep crisis we find ourselves today. Every day, literally every day, a boat or a ship is sinking in the Mediterranean graveyard, while tourists from Europe, from Belgium, from Brussels, from all over the world are carefree and swimming in the Mediterranean graveyard. And this reminded me of a great Austrian writer called Stefan Zweig. So just before the outbreak of the First World War, in one of his best books, I would say, in his autobiography, Die Welt von gestern, The World of Yesterday, Stefan Zweig described how at the same time when Gavrilo Princip shot Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, people around the baths, in the baths around Vienna were swimming carefree and in a similar way like they are swimming today in the Adriatic Sea. 4 years later, in a text which is rather unknown, again by Stefan Zweig, the title in German is Bei den Sorglosen, which the translation would be At the Carefree People. Stefan Zweig writes about the rich bourgeoisie who is skiing, dancing, and having a pleasant time, parties and so on, in the mountains of St. Moritz. And that was 1918, so the year when the First World war ended, but the year also when the Spanish flu started, the year when hyperinflation started, massive unemployment, the year when a year later D'Annunzio would occupy Rijeka and would install a proto-fascist government, inspire Mussolini. After that you would have Mussolini, Weimar Republic in crisis, rising fascism, rising Nazism, ending up with Hitler and with Holocaust and with the Second World War. So we find ourselves in a similar situation today. And instead of Zweig, I mean, there is a very short diary entry by another writer, Franz Kafka, who illustrates this point even better. Namely, his diary on August 2nd, 1914, Franz Kafka writes just 2 sentences. Germany has declared war on Russia when swimming in the afternoon. And that's it. And you can see that, you know, even this kind of individuals, great writers, intellectuals, also were living this kind of contradiction which we are living today. That at the same time we are aware that a war is happening in Ukraine. We can see a nuclear-powered military ship in front of Split, which is supposedly securing Europe. People are swimming, but at the same time the war is happening, refugees are drowning, and this is our reality today. So why am I in Brussels then today? Obviously I'm here to support this courageous initiative and to try to help as much as I can to make it happen. But let's face it, Brussels doesn't really have a good reputation in Europe. Although it's a vibrant and culturally rich and artistically rich city, if you would ask any European today, or even someone who is outside of Europe, what's their first association when they hear the word Brussels? Probably the first association would also start with the letter B, and it would be bureaucracy. From Baudelaire to Donald Trump, Brussels was compared to a hellhole. Okay, Trump is the same guy who also said that Belgium is a great city, not Brussels but Belgium, so to put him in the same sentence with Charles Baudelaire is maybe not fair enough, but you can see that there is a continuity which shows Brussels as a city which is rather understood as a depressive, boring, bureaucratic hellhole city. Capital of Europe or capital of anything, you will rarely hear people identify Brussels as that. And why did, in the first place, Brussels become the capital of Europe? As you know, it comes from the alphabet. Because in 1958, 6 founding members gathered and they decided that one city has to host all the EU institutions, and the most fair process would be just to pick up the first alphabetic city, so it was Brussels. And that's the reason why Brussels is the capital of Europe, so-called capital of Europe. So there is no intrinsic reason why Brussels would be the capital of Europe. There is no deeper meaning to it. It was just another bureaucratic decision. The Austrian writer Robert Menasse, as you probably know, who was awarded for the novel, even wrote a novel which is called Hauptstadt, the capital, which is a novel on Brussels as the capital of Europe. But it's a satirical novel. So you can't even have Brussels as a capital of Europe as something serious, you know? How can you be serious about it? However, I'm here today to support this initiative for Brussels as the capital of imagination and creativity in 2030, which might sound paradoxical, of course. And I know it's a very difficult, but at the same time exciting task to imagine Brussels as the capital of ideas and imagination for, as it says, not here, but in the title, 5 million Europeans. And here just a camaraderie critique, it should be 500 million EU citizens, because there are many more Europeans in Europe today, and the European Union is not the same as Europe, and Europe is not the same as the EU. Because also Serbia, Montenegro, Ukraine are part of Europe, and hopefully they would also become part of the European Union. So I think we have to be a bit more precise in that as well. It's difficult to imagine Brussels as the capital of anything, because it takes not only a lot of courage and creativity to imagine Brussels from today's perspective in such an important and leading role. What is a prerequisite to actually imagine Brussels in 2030 as the capital of Europe or the European Union is to dive deeper into our contemporary problems, the structural problems of the so-called European project today, such as rising or continuous inequality, the everlasting divide between the periphery and the center. I don't know how many here still remember the so-called PIGS, which was an acronym for the countries of Portugal, Ireland, Spain, and Greece. And we could, of course, now add the country where I come from, Croatia, or many other countries. So this divide didn't disappear, this divide is rising again. And what is happening is actually that the European Union is outsourcing and creating borders outside of what they call the European Union. Then, of course, there is the problem of an aging population and the crisis or the fall of natality. The famous movie by Alfonso Cuarón, Children of Men, where he depicts a future UK society where actually no children are being born and refugees are in cages. This is already becoming reality. Then, of course, there is the problem of the rise of the far right and authoritarian regimes. You've probably seen what's happening in Germany today, where AfD is not Alternative für Deutschland. The neo-Nazis, although there is nothing neo in them, are around 20%, and they are even entering municipal governments. And last but not least, one of our contemporary problems, of course, is the utter climate crisis. It's not climate change, it's a crisis. And of course, it's the never-ending war and wars, not just the war in Ukraine. And as you can see, these wars are coming back home, coming back to the European Union itself. So why do we have to dive deeper into all these characteristics of our contemporary crisis? Because all these are not only producing effects in Brussels already today, but it is very often that it is the political Brussels itself which is contributing to these problems or is even making them deeper. When it comes to migration, for instance, when it comes to the militarization of outer borders, when it comes to the rising divide between the center and the periphery of the European Union. So how does the European Union look like today? I'll offer you just a few random associations. I could go, of course, into numbers, into economy, into statistics and so on, but that's not my field and you would find it rather boring. So I will give you more artistical, cultural examples, which I think can paint a picture, at least how I see the European project today. My first association is the recent Booker winner book Time Shelter by Georgi Gospodinov, who is a Bulgarian writer who wrote a beautiful book with a kind of science fiction premise. Namely, a mysterious therapist called Jostin constructs a clinic that treats patients with Alzheimer by recreating the past in which they feel more secure. So this past clinic begins with different rooms and floors. Decade by decade, therapeutic time shelters allow patients to inhabit their temporal safe spaces. In one of the book's many dark jokes, a Romanian patient finds solace in remembering not what he experienced, but what he fantasized about, a life in the United States. So as you can see here already, nostalgia is not about what you had, but a memory of what you wanted. And the clinic is so successful that even clients who don't have Alzheimer enter the clinic, and then they have a room with, matchboxes, with Barbie or Ken, actually recreating the safe spaces, the safe environment of their childhood in which they will live safely. In Time Shelter, the EU, just like today, is confronting the rise of nationalism and a possible collapse. So what does the EU decide? Instead of facing the uncertainties of what lies ahead, just like what the EU is doing today, the EU decides that each country of the European Union will hold a referendum. A referendum into which past decade to return. So each country holds a referendum to choose which decade they will inhabit now, and they see the choice as living together in a shared past, which we have already done, or letting ourselves fall apart and slaughtering one another, which we also already have done. So for instance, France and Spain choose the 1980s, Portugal chooses 1970s, Romania and Belgium choose the 1960s. It's a question why, we can answer it later. And the UK, of course, doesn't take part in the referendum because they had another referendum called Brexit. And I think this is a perfect embodiment of our situation in Europe today, where actually Europe, instead of, not Europe, but the European Union, instead of propelling itself into the future, it resembles more and more Walter Benjamin's depiction of Paul Klee's Angelus Novus, where it's actually returning to the past, where it is what is called progress, according to Benjamin, is nothing but the accumulation of catastrophes. Which brings me to another association about our European project today. There's a forgotten text by the great philosopher George Lukács, which he wrote in 1933, which is the year, as you know, when Hitler came to power, and Lukács himself was forced to flee and to save his life. And the name of the text is Grand Hotel Abyss. In translation, Grand Hotel Abgrund in German, in translation, Grand Hotel Abyss. His depiction, in a way, is similar to Georgy Gospodinov. I don't know whether Gospodinov was influenced by Lukács, whether he even knows about the text. It's a very short text which depicts a luxurious hotel with plenty of rooms, and you can choose your room, whether it's a jazz room, a room with a swimming pool, another room, and so on, where you can take comfort and look at the abyss which is in front of you. Of course, this text by George Lukács was a harsh critique of the Frankfurt School, of Adorno, Horkheimer, and many other theorists who at that time were actually theorizing Nazism, theorizing capitalism, but at that time they didn't take part in the resistance or tried to defeat it. Actually, most of them emigrated and made their career in the United States. A quote by Lukács about the hotel. So it's a beautiful hotel equipped with every comfort on the edge of an abyss, of nothingness, of absurdity. And the daily contemplation of the abyss between excellent meals and artistic entertainments can only heighten the enjoyment of the subtle comforts offered. So just to spoil actually one of my points, to which I will come a bit later, I think what we should be avoiding with Brussels 2030 is precisely this. You know, to create this kind of hotel, Grand Hotel Abyss, or time shelter, where we will be all very happy that we actually have gotten the candidacy and the cultural capital of Europe, but at the same time we would be retreating in all these rooms which would be providing more comfort, while at the same time ships, boats with refugees would be sinking daily in the Mediterranean graveyard, and all the other problems which I mentioned would still be here. Another association of our contemporary European project today would be, I don't know whether you watched, he died recently, Jean-Luc Godard's film Socialism. It's a beautiful movie from 2010 where you have a big luxurious cruiser which is cruising the Mediterranean Sea. But what you have on the cruiser is that you have, for instance, the French philosopher Alain Badiou giving a lecture in front of a completely empty lecture hall. You have the singer Patti Smith wandering around with her guitar, but no one actually gives a damn. And it shows this kind of collapse of the European idea. Because Godard didn't choose a warship like Harry S. Truman to illustrate the European project today. Godard didn't choose a speedboat, for instance. But Godard has chosen, and I think very consciously, a slow but huge, luxurious cruiser. Incidentally or not, 2 years after Godard shot the movie, this same cruiser hit a rock in our seas and it collapsed in itself. The name of the cruiser was Costa Concordia. But you actually took Costa Concordia, that's the main character of the film, and in a prophetic way kind of showed what would happen not just to Costa Concordia but also to Europe itself. Namely, Costa Concordia, the very name of this cruiser, which is this illustration of the EU today, the very name symbolizes Concordia, harmony and unity of the European project. And you know that it had 13 decks. The upper deck, which was a kind of paying homage to the suffering of the Polish people, was called Poland. Then below Poland was the deck which was called Austria. Portugal, Spain, Germany, France. In the middle of the ship there was an atrium called Europe, then there was a London saloon, then there was a Disco Lisbon and a Berlin bar. So once this famous cruiser collapsed, you could have seen in which way also the European Union would go. Isn't the captain of Costa Concordia, who the night before the disaster, according to witnesses, was spending his time in the company of beautiful women drinking expensive wine, also a metaphor of the current financial elites of the European Union? Isn't the captain who left the ship before the passengers similar to the bankers who always leave the sinking boat on time, leaving the people of the periphery of the European Union to drown? And last but not least, that's my last association and illustration embodiment of the failure of the European project today. Of course, you could say it's stretched, but it comes from art. Is a recent movie by Ruben Östlund called The Triangle of Sadness. Because it also shows in which way you have these parallel realities. In the same sea where hundreds and thousands of refugees fleeing war, drought, climate crisis are sinking, you have the super rich, the same as the submarine, who by the way paid $250,000 for one seat, while the poor refugees on the ship which Chloe mentioned paid $4,000, enjoy their luxurious life. Remember the scene in Triangle of Sadness with Woody Harrelson as the captain, and the Croatian actor Zlatko Buric. Usually it's people from Croatia who portray Russian oligarchs. You probably remember, because we speak like that, you know, so they think we are Russians. You remember Rade Šerbedžija in Eyes Wide Shut by Kubrick. Again, he's a mafioso from Russia, and there are plenty of them. So Zlatko Buric plays this Russian oligarch who is a self-described shit seller. And then one of the most famous scenes on the ship, as you probably know, is when they have this conversation. They're completely drunk and they speak to the mic and everyone has to listen while they are puking and so on. And this is also a critique of the left today, I would say. Because the left today, and also the Greens, not to mention the Greens who are actually still in power in some countries like in Germany, the left or the Greens are becoming more and more like this podcast on a sinking ship. In the same way as in Triangle of Sadness, you know, just throwing quotes by Lenin, by Marx and so on, while the ship is actually sinking. And here, unfortunately, we must stop with associations and the diagnosis of the European Union today to turn to the future. Namely, it is precisely out of this dark picture which I just painted, and I could have mentioned many other examples, many other numbers and so on, that we have to try to imagine a much bolder, a much more equal, a much fairer, and if I dare to say also a utopian future, not just for Brussels, but also for Europe and for the rest of the world. And it necessarily, because we speak about 2030, entails a social science fiction experiment. So if you want to speak about Brussels becoming the European capital of culture in 2030, it necessarily means we also have to be talking about Brussels and the world in 2030. Here around, behind the curtain there, on that side, you have exhibitions which actually try to go in that direction, to imagine what would it look like. But I could offer also some other predictions. In 2030, 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees will be a past. So we will have a new normal where Brussels might turn into a kind of Mediterranean city, which means that also the urban problems will face a new challenge. The poor populations, especially of parts of cities such as Molenbeek, which hopefully will become the capital of culture in 2030, will face many more problems than those people who, for instance, have air conditioners. So that's just one aspect of 2030 which we might face. Then another one, according to the United Nations projections, in 2030 we will face an even further urbanization of the world. So that the urban populations in 2030 will increase for 1.3 billion, which means that more than 5 billion people in 2030 will live in urban areas. That means also that we have to tackle the question of the urban question and how do our cities look like. Then, of course, I wouldn't be me if I didn't consult McKinsey. I mean, I didn't consult them, their usual consulting, but I just visited their website because I find it very interesting to see what those kind of people are like, how they are imagining the future of 2030. So unlike me, who just told you, that the climate crisis will definitely be even worse, that the urban problems will rise, inequality will rise, migration due to climate crisis will rise, militarization will rise, and so on, McKinsey paints a rather completely different picture. So in 2019, they invited business leaders and experts to describe how 2030s might look like. And surprise, they called it the next normal, which I think, of course, is a very problematic term, having in mind that this new normal was so much exploited and it was filled with all sorts of meaning. And when they imagine this next normal in the 2030s, they speak of space tourism and summer on Mars in 2030. It is as if you can hear the echo of Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk and the Silicon Valley dreams. They're speaking about electric flying vehicles, air taxis. Of course, they have been speaking about it 100 years ago, we still don't have it. They speak about smart cocktails and food, which will be available to everyone in 2030s. If you ask the question, what is a smart cocktail or smart food? Well, it's a cocktail which knows much better than you what kind of cocktail you need in order to be more talkative, to be more social or attractive or whatever. And smart food, of course, is food which will know better what kind of ingredients you need to stay healthy, to stay awake or whatever. They speak about drones, which will deliver packages in 2030, and they speak about movies which will be interactive and immersive like video games. Nothing about climate crisis, nothing about inequality, and of course nothing about the crisis of capitalism. So the future painted by McKinsey, the future of 2030, is all about consumption. It's all about consumerism and what Evgeny Morozov called technological solutionism. It is technology, again, which provides the solution, and only if we follow technology and use technology, we will find a bright future in the 2030s. But I think instead of having this kind of picture in mind, or even the other one, on the one hand you have a dark picture which portrays 2030 as a time of utter climate crisis, of a deeper crisis than we have today, and on the other side you have this kind of technological utopians who believe that it is Silicon Valley technology which will save us. I think what is necessary is to speak about possible different futures. Not just one future, but many futures. The possibilities and potentialities which can go into various directions. Obviously, climate crisis is, at the current moment, inevitable, which doesn't mean that we have to, commit suicide or not have children because it's inevitable, but at the same time, what we have to take into account is the unpredictable. So on the one hand, you have the inevitable, but on the other hand, you have the unpredictable. Things which can happen, which no one actually can assume they might happen. But at the same time, what is important and why I believe we are here today is that we have to not only prepare for this future, buy an air conditioner in Molenbeek, whatever, that would be pretty ridiculous. Of course, it could save a life, but it would be pretty ridiculous in the sense of believing that this might, in a way, stop this future from happening. So the question why I believe we are all here today is how can exactly Brussels become the catalyst, not only of imagining these different futures, but creating them? How can Brussels turn into a cultural and artistic laboratory that can inspire 500 million European citizens and also other Europeans who are living today in Kosovo, in Montenegro, in Serbia, in Ukraine, and many other countries which are not part of the European Union, but are part of Europe? How can the rest, to turn the question around, how can the rest of the world inspire Brussels as it did for decades and for centuries? Because there wouldn't be Brussels without Congo, for instance. There wouldn't be Brussels without colonialism. There wouldn't be Brussels without the massive influx of people who are not even Europeans but come from other parts of the world. Is the future, that's also one of the questions I think we have to pose towards 2030, the future of nation states, or is it rather a future of stronger cities, or is it rather a future of re-villaging? You know, the trend which we are witnessing since the pandemic, that more and more people are actually leaving cities. To go to villages, to go to areas where they have fresh air, a natural environment, and so on. Is the nation state going to survive, and what will it be? You know, just take the figures which talk about the crisis of natality in Europe and aging populations. My country, where I come from, Croatia, at the moment it has less than 4 million people. Hundreds of thousands young people emigrated to Europe to find a job. Now we have a trend that people from Nepal, India, and so on are emigrating to Croatia to fill the jobs which the Croatians are not willing to do for a miserable salary of 700 euros and 12 hours working a day for Uber or deliveries and so on. According to projections, in 2100, Croatia will have 2 million citizens. So the question is, you know, what does a national flag mean in this context? You know, will these countries such as Croatia, but even Belgium, turn into a kind of zoo, into a kind of completely artificial community which is still clinging to the past of nation states and what Benedict Anderson called imagined communities? Yes, we could imagine that as well, that you will have 2 million in Croatia, building a huge wall around Croatia towards Bosnia and Herzegovina, for instance, which was once part of socialist Yugoslavia in the same country, and they will live there, be proud Croatians, while all the other nationalities will actually do the dirty jobs for them. And you already have this situation today. So as I said, I came from the Adriatic Sea. The summer season is in full swing. In Croatia, you can see Belgians, Brits, Americans, people from all around the world who have money to pay lunch, 100 euros, to pay accommodation, more than 100 euros and so on, and to spend a few thousand euros for a 10-day vacation in Croatia. At the same time, around 80% of the Croatian population cannot afford themselves to go to the Croatian Sea. So that's already the situation which we are facing in Croatia. And I could imagine similar characteristics and effects here in Brussels itself, you know, where the people who live here actually cannot afford the services which are supposedly provided to them. At the same time, of course, public services as healthcare, social housing, and so on are being privatized, so that if you want to have healthcare, you need money. If you want to study, you need to go into debt, similar like in the United States. So these are just some of the questions. As you can see, I'm providing more questions than answers. But I think to pose real questions and important questions, sometimes it's more important than the answers. You know, only by posing the questions you can arrive at an answer. Another question is it sufficient, faced with other consequences of climate crisis, to build climate shelters, for instance? You've seen that's a trend which is now happening all around Europe. I think Barcelona, under the governance of Ada Colau, who unfortunately lost, was one of the cities who was building the biggest number of climate shelters. That means like turning a room like this into a room with air conditioning, where the poorer parts of the population can actually hide from heat waves, which are becoming the next normal, as McKinsey called it, you know. You've seen it last year. We had continuous heat waves where the temperature was more than 40 degrees all around Europe. And it already started. As a consequence, you have drought. As a consequence, you have failing crops. As a consequence, you have an even bigger economic crisis and an even bigger social crisis. So is it sufficient to tackle climate crisis, although I think it's a good project, by building climate shelters, or should we be doing both? Responding with creative and urgent solutions to the ongoing poly-crisis, but at the same time questioning and rebuilding the very foundations of our economies, societies, and cultures in order to create such a future in which inequality, for instance, the fact that it's the poor parts of Brussels facing the worst effects of climate crisis, so that this future of inequality wouldn't exist. It reminds me of a famous text by Oscar Wilde, where he describes a situation where you have a beggar on the street who is begging for money, And Oscar Wilde said the solution is not to give him a penny, or in today's context a euro. The solution is to create such a society where a beggar would be impossible. You know? So in that sense, I think we have to create a society. Of course, we need climate shelters, but we have to restructure our economies and societies in such a profound way that it would be impossible that the poorer segments of population wouldn't have access to so-called climate shelters. And last but not least, and I'm finishing soon, what is the role of cities and cultural institutions in this Herculean undertaking? And how can activists and social movements, artists and cultural producers foster the necessary changes through a democratic process open to all citizens of Brussels, but I would go even beyond. So what is obvious, and here comes perhaps one answer, is that we don't have only to imagine different futures, but we actually have to start working on it. What I've seen and what I really appreciate with this project is that you actually started by a participatory democratic process involving the younger population, involving people who are not Europeans, who are not white, who are not integrated in the society, to not just imagine, but to already prescribe different futures for 2030. And I think this is crucial because it's not just sufficient, that's my response to the title of this panel, it's not just sufficient to imagine, although we need utopian thinking more than ever today. I think we have to be much more precise. And if you don't believe me, I'll offer you a joke which embodies this best. It's a joke about a poor fisherman who catches a golden fish. Of course, a variety of these jokes, there are thousands of them. And the fish says, okay, if you release me, I will grant you 3 wishes. The poor fisherman thinks a bit and he says, okay, here are my 3 wishes. I want to be part of a royal family. I don't have to be king, just part of royal family. I want a castle and a beautiful princess or woman. He goes home, lies into his straw bed, and wakes up next morning. He wakes up in a castle. The beautiful wife comes and says, "Wake up, Franz Ferdinand, we have to go to Sarajevo." So you see, the problem, I mean, to paraphrase the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze, who said famously, if you're trapped in the dream of the other, you're fucked. Literal translation of Gilles Deleuze. The problem, as you can see from this joke, is that, yeah, of course we can imagine different futures. But if this imagination is imprecise, you could end up like Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. So it's not enough to just imagine, okay, in 2030 we want Brussels to become the capital of culture of Europe. I think what is necessary and what is actually happening all these days at this summer assembly is to speak about the very concrete projects, the very concrete steps which will actually lead to this future of 2030. So in a way, to put it differently, already today in 2023, we have to act as if it's 2030. You know, already this program should be the face of the program of 2030, which in a way it is. And if we speak about dreams and imagination, then of course we have to pose the question, what is the dream of Europe today? Not the dream of Europe, but how Europe could look like, not the dream of Europe and how Europe could look like, but the dream today's Europe, if there is such a thing, is dreaming of. And if you ask me and many people here in the room, it's obvious that the dream of Europe, or more precise, the dream of the European Union today, is more growth, more militarization, more greenwashing, less democratic participation, import of cheap labor force, with militarizing the outer borders of Europe and turning the Mediterranean into a graveyard. So in this context, I think we have to start dreaming, not just dreaming a different Europe, but actually creating a different Europe. As you know, next year there are European elections. I'm not optimistic at all how they will turn out. There are plenty of elections in Belgium. So these are all political events which will also shape the future and the coming future, which is coming in 2030. So I think we have to take that into account as well. But what we have to start doing today, and I'm concluding by that, it's not just imagination and utopian thinking as much as we need it today, but actually very concrete plans and steps which we are actually undertaking already today. It means detecting the urban problems of the city, for instance. Why isn't Brussels, similar to Amsterdam, a bicycle city? Why do we have so many cars? Why do we have cars at all? Why do we have private cars? You know, you have all this ideology about electric cars saving humanity, but it's the same model of ownership which is not changing the structure of capitalism today. Then there are the questions, you know, of what is a public space, what is a private space. Brussels, like many cities all around the world, is going into the direction of further privatization of public spaces. So I think what Brussels 2030 should do is to turn Brussels into a completely public city, if you want, like that. So that, you know, also immigrants, citizens of poor background can enter the institutions. But not just enter the institutions, but work in them. You know, what I would really love to see is to avoid the kind of cynical situations which are very often created when you have a top-down project of including people of poorer or migration background. I'll give you an example, and then I will stop soon, and then we'll join the panel. A few years ago, I was invited by Burgtheater, which is one of the most famous theaters in Europe, to co-curate a program with Oliver Frljić, who is one of the best Croatian theater directors now working at Gorki Theater in Berlin. And we started, so the theater, the intendant at that time said, oh, Vienna, in a similar way, I can read now, Brussels is a city of hundreds of thousands of migrants. Vienna actually is the biggest Serbian city after Belgrade, and it has so many people from ex-Yugoslavia. How could we integrate those people into the theater, you know? How could we make Burgtheater, which is the embodiment of high culture of the bourgeoisie since ever, how could we open this space to those people? And me and Oliver Frljić started from Bertolt Brecht, you know, that famous poem about the worker who asked questions, you know, who has built all these palaces, who has prepared the food for Alexander the Great, and so on. And we decided, and we worked with around 20 to 30 mainly migrants in Vienna. And then at one day, we planned to go to the Burgtheater to visit the office of the intendant of the director of Burgtheater at that time, to pose him a very simple question. What's your salary? Because I think these are the kind of questions you also have to ask, you know, the questions about an economic situation. And we were very open at the very beginning, Frljić and me, we told those people, those 20, 30 people, what were our fees. They were working for free, of course, because they hoped that would be a kind of entrance to this very elitist institution, which for some of them, luckily I can say in the end it was. And we said, okay, if we don't question ourselves, if we don't question the institution itself, which engaged us to do this kind of project, then we're doing nothing. And then it's not Brechtian at all. So one day we sent an email to the secretary of Martin Kušej, who was the intendant at that time, asking could the 20, 30 of us, you know, there were kids 14 years old, Turkish, Albanian, there was a pensioner, 70 years old. It was a very diverse group, whether we could come to his office to pose him some questions and to pose him the question about his salary. And you know what was the answer? No. And we never visited the director's office because he didn't want to answer this question. Why didn't he want to answer the question? Because at the same time there was a scandal in Austria that Burgtheater paid, I think, €500,000 or even more for a stage production. Hundreds of thousands of euros for a stage production where people from migrant background, 20, 30 of them or something, are paid nothing, although they want to include them. So I think, you know, if we speak about radical inclusion, if we speak about inclusion of people of migration or poor background, we also have to tackle our own positions. We have to tackle our own contradictions. We have to tackle the contradictions of capitalism in which we are living today, and not just use those people as a kind of flag, okay, we are inclusive and so on. So, besides tackling these questions and contradictions, besides questioning the urban questions, mapping the city and the situation of Brussels today, and hoping that the cultural capital could actually foster these changes, instead of, as the Museum of Capitalism behind the curtain shows, rising the rents in Molenbeek, which might be an effect after it, I think what we have to do today, and that's already happening here, and I'm really welcoming it, is, as Chloe said, citizen assemblies, participation of citizens, involving social movements, involving activists in the reimagination, but not just reimagination of Brussels, but actually enacting Brussels 2030, which would be a city which wouldn't face some of the problems I showed today. Thanks a lot. I'm finishing here, but I'm really happy to join the discussion.